He withdrew $4 billion from Malaysia's budget and remained free. The man pretended to be a lawyer, a doctor, an airplane pilot, and managed to work in these professions without understanding a damn thing about them. They even made a movie about him, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. So today, I want to tell you the story of a man who makes Abagnale look like a petty scoundrel. Jho Low didn't skimp on professions. He took things much higher. He managed to pretend he possessed unlimited power and money, that with a single word, he could open doors to ministers' offices and sheikhs' palaces. Jho first attended an international school in Georgetown, and then went to the UK, to the private school Harrow, which in its time was attended by many outstanding figures, from Cumberbatch and Byron to Rothschild and Churchill. Here he was, surrounded by the children of sultans and sheikhs, whose parents were not only wealthier, but also enjoyed a much higher social standing. It was in this environment that Jho began to develop a talent for social mimicry. While studying at Harrow, Low told everyone he was actually a Malaysian prince, not the son of a successful swindler. To back up his theory, he even asked his father to arrange a deal with a billionaire friend so that while he was away, Jho could invite his school friends to relax on his yacht and at his mansion. And to make sure everyone believed that this was his house, Low first replaced all the photographs of the owner's family with photographs of his family. Teenagers of 15 and 16 had no need to double-check whether he really was a prince or not. And Low's forgery was a success. The other Malaysians at school, of course, laughed at him, but Jho no longer cared. He achieved what he wanted. Children, nobles, and rulers accepted him as one of their own. He continued in the same spirit at the University of Pennsylvania, where he enrolled after graduating from Harrow. There, he drove expensive rented cars, threw parties costing tens of thousands of dollars, spending months paying for them, and blew almost all the money his father sent him at casinos. And all this was all for the sake of fitting in among the richest and most influential students. Surprisingly, it worked again. It worked. Along with Jho and Harrow came the rumor that he was a Malaysian prince, and Low, spending money left and right, only confirmed these rumors. And although no one could say for sure who he was, they were happy to contact him because he had money and knew how to spend it cheerfully. Low's contacts were primarily with people from the Middle East, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and so on. And the closer he became to them, the more he realized the wealth that flowed there. These countries were reborn when oil was discovered. Dollars flowed like a river, and a small group of people controlled the flow in each country. Jho set out to get as close to this group as possible. To do this, he invited his comrades to visit him and organized a kind of tour of the Middle East, where he tried to make as many contacts as possible. And since the Wilmaj children with whom Jho had interacted at Harrow had not been particularly in touch with him, and there were none at Penn State, the acquaintances who agreed to take him in were mostly the children of businessmen who had little or no contact with the ruling class. In the United Arab Emirates, he managed to meet Yusuf al-Ataiba, the sheikh's advisor on the country's foreign policy. Ataiba came from a very wealthy family, received a first-class education in the United States, and by the age of 30, had achieved significant success in his political career. However, his father had many children, which meant Ataiba didn't receive much money from him. He himself had been focused on his political career for a long time, and when he achieved a position close to the sheikhs, he realized how much better one could live with more resources. Jho himself has good connections in Malaysia and could help shut down these deals. Ataiba took the bait and introduced Low to several other influential people, the most important of whom was Khaldoon Khalifa al-Mubarak, who headed the sovereign wealth fund Mubadala Development. Al-Mubarak controlled tens of billions of dollars and was exactly what Low was looking for. Jho told him the same story as Ataiba. Al-Mubarak, who had a better understanding of economic matters, was wary of the young Malaysian's proposal and asked for more concrete suggestions than just a description of how to invest in the growing Asian market. This was the jackpot. Low managed to pull the wool over the eyes of a man who controls billions. The project that would propel Jho into the big game was the Iskandar development region, a gigantic construction project aimed at creating a financial center capable of competing with Singapore. Low learned that the Kazan Fund, which was responsible for the project, was seeking partners willing to invest large sums of money. Jho immediately approached them and said he was an unofficial representative of Malaysia's Mubadala Development Fund, which was willing to invest its own money. Kazan expressed interest, and Low traveled to the Emirates, where he introduced himself to Al Mubaraka. Now, as an unofficial representative of the Kazan Foundation, Low understood that if he wanted to succeed in the world of big money, he would need political patronage. Rozak was the ideal candidate. Low was well acquainted with Najib's pasang, Riza Aziz. Low, once again assuming the aura of a VIP, told Rozak that he had arranged a very large deal that could potentially benefit the people of Malaysia. However, he does not want fame, but wants Najib to publicly take all the credit, which will have a good effect on his political image. In the end, everything worked out wonderfully for Low. His Middle Eastern partners were confident of his influence in Malaysia. As a result of the Iskandar deal, Malaysia received $500 million from Mubadala Development Fund and tens of millions more from other Middle Eastern funds also interested in the project. All of Low's contacts, both in the Middle East and Malaysia, profited from the deal. As soon as these people accepted their shares, Jho immediately went to Malaysian banks to ask for loans, operating with whoever is a shareholder of his company. In this way, he managed to raise about $20 million, with which he bought several companies involved in construction in the Iskandar project, as well as the land where this construction was to take place. He then created several offshore companies in the Seychelles called ADIA Investment Corporation and KIA Investment Corporation. These companies also bought small stakes in construction firms they had previously acquired. Thus, Low created yet another illusion. In reality, he simply took out loans and bought several construction firms. However, to everyone around him, it seemed like he, along with the aristocrats from Kuwait and Malaysia, was doing something extremely clever and potentially profitable. After all, such people and organizations couldn't possibly be wrong. All that was left was to find an extremely rich, but not particularly smart person to sell this illusion to at an inflated price. That person turned out to be Taib Mahmud, the head of the Malaysian state of Sarawak. Taib bought Low's construction companies and land for 5 times their original price, paying the young Malaysian $110 million. Most would have stopped there, as the sum was colossal. Up until then, Low had always tried to curry favor with the family. He helped Rozak's children with money, paid for their education, and so on. But most importantly, he bribed Najib's wife, Rosmah Mansour, with gifts, as she wielded considerable influence over the Prime Minister, and Rozak proved more pliable than the Sultan. Low spun a yarn about how he would attract billions of dollars from the Middle East, how this money would then be invested in everything from green energy and tourism development in Malaysia itself to profitable projects abroad. Thus, under Rozak's patronage, a new sovereign wealth fund was created in Malaysia to be called Van Malaysia Development Berhad, or Van MDB. Jho Low, of course, assumed control. Low's first major deal on behalf of the fund was a joint venture with the Saudi oil company PetroSaudi. As soon as Jho received $110 million from the sale of his construction companies, he began partying wildly in the States. To make his life easier, he hired a man named Saleh Ghebreyesus. Sal was in the business of organizing vacations for wealthy individuals. He did everything for them, from booking tables at restaurants to arranging a private jet filled with models. Low gained Saleh's trust and began asking about his clients, learning in one conversation that one of them was the Saudi Arabian prince, the Turkish Ibn Abdullah Al Saud. Prince Turki was one of more than 20 children of Saudi Arabia's rulers. He was not particularly successful in either politics or business. His main enterprise, however, was a small oil company, PetroSaudi, run by Tariq Abe. Ultimately, Rozak and the Turkish prince did meet and agree on a joint project. PetroSaudi invested her oil assets in the project. the rights to develop fields in Turkmenistan and Argentina worth $2.5 billion, while one MDB invested $1 billion to carry out the development. In short, they decided it wasn't necessary at all, and that $300 million would be enough for imitation and activity. The remaining $700 could be spent much more cheerfully. All you need to know is that they set up a company in the Seychelles with one bearer share called Goodstar Limited. Then they convinced the banks that were setting up joint accounts for Peter Saud and one MDB that $300 million should be deposited into those same joint accounts. But 700 rubles were supposed to go to the account of Goodstar Limited, supposedly to repay Peter Saudi's loan. Of course, there was no loan, and the money went to a company controlled by Low. Jho gave about $250 million of that to Abaid, who had already transferred the bulk to Prince Turki. Make sure they hand over the briefcase with the money, and what Low got, he spent on his own luxurious life, the luxurious life of Prime Minister Rozak's family, and on his political needs. This time, the Prime Minister allocated $800 million from the Malaysian budget, most of which was also siphoned off to Low's accounts in various ways. Naturally, this didn't help either. The fund was unprofitable by all measures, which is hardly surprising. However, only those on the inside knew this. Externally, and most importantly on paper, FanMDB remained a successful enterprise almost until its closure. Here too, Low managed to create illusions, revaluations of Petro-Saudi oil fields by loyal experts, accounting reports from companies, those willing to turn a blind eye to many things, as well as various economic gimmicks, made it possible to ensure that the fund remained profitable in the reports, without dialogues with atmospheric sounds or walking maximum. These $1.8 billion that were invested in the joint project with Petro-Saudi Arabia, but never reached, had to be covered somehow so that no one would have any questions about where the money was. Then, Low and his accountant came up with a scheme. They took $1 billion worth of Peter Saudi's investments in a joint drilling rig project. They then sold them for $2.3 billion to a Cayman Islands fund, which paid not in cash, but in shares of its fund. Of course, the shares weren't backed by anything, but on paper, ANDB reported a return of $500 million, which the accommodating accountants happily approved. However, in reality, as you've already understood, no money was added, and in the meantime, not only the fund, but also Low himself was running out of money. So Jho upped the ante and came up with a new scheme. He devised a plan for NHDB to buy up numerous power plant companies, merge them into one, and then go public. Under the guise of raising funds to purchase a power plant, Low planned to issue 10-year bonds worth $1.95 billion. Rather than wait for all the bonds to be sold and receive the money immediately, he turned to Goldman Sachs Bank. Jho sold the bonds to the bank and received $1.75 billion immediately. The bank, in turn, sold the bonds and earned $200 million. Everyone except the bondholders was in the clear. Low immediately pocketed $600 million of the proceeds and used the remaining funds to buy power plants at inflated prices, receiving kickbacks from their owners. When the money ran out, he issued another bond for the same amount and sold them again to Goldman Sachs. In total, he managed to siphon off $1.5 billion from this scam. In just the time he managed the fund, Low managed to steal more than $4.5 billion. After that kind of money, he started having fun. He'd fly to Vegas, lose a couple of tens of thousands of dollars at the casino, then head off to a club somewhere, find some beautiful girls there, and then move on to a luxury hotel room, continuing the fun until the morning. Low raised the bar for his parties to a stratospheric level. The stars themselves, reporters, escorts, service staff, everyone who'd ever attended such events, unanimously declared they'd never seen such a grandeur. He bought a stake in Emmy's music company, which at the time produced artists such as Kanye West, Beyoncé, Usher, Alicia Keys, and Pharrell Williams. He also founded his company, Red Granite Pictures, which, during its existence, managed to release such films as Wall Street, Papillon, and Dumb and Dumber 2. And the fact that he owned apartments and houses all over the world and could afford to drive any car, I think, goes without saying. However, things couldn't continue like this forever. The longer the fund operated, the more people somehow learned or began to suspect that Low was stealing money. And his playboy behavior, which he displayed around the world, didn't inspire confidence. The other side of this coin is that, firstly, he had to constantly suppress protest sentiments within the fund itself, which is one of the reasons why there was a high turnover at all levels of management. Secondly, he needed some logical justification for the wealth that had befallen him. To do this, he created a complex web of financial transactions, ultimately receiving the money from his father's account. The second method was acquiring real estate and businesses. This included founding a film production company and purchasing a stake in a music company, as well as buying up houses, apartments, and hotels around the world. For example, Jho owned the El Hermitage Hotel in Los Angeles for a time. The third method was the purchase of works of art, mostly paintings. Low hid approximately $350 million in art and stored it in the free port of Geneva. Xavier Justo, who served as head of Peter Saudi's London office, he was the one who handled that deal with the drilling rigs. Naturally, Justo's superiors were involved, and he found out about it. Xavier, however, had no intention of spreading the word and continued working in his position for a couple of years afterward. However, as a precaution, he copied all the information from the company's servers. He ended up with 140 gigabytes of data, consisting of 448,000 emails, documents, and other official papers, including evidence of Jho Low's fraud. When Justo resigned, he was underpaid 2.5 million Swiss francs of the promised severance pay of 4. Then Xavier began to blackmail Peter Saudi with the information he had managed to copy. However, Petra Saudi, through one of his directors, Patrick Mahoney, told Justo to get lost. Low, however, was completely unaware of the situation. Xavier was a little saddened by the failed blackmail and began searching for someone willing to buy this information for 2.5 million. That's where his path crossed with journalist Claire Rifkassel-Brown, who managed to find a sponsor for the purchase of this data in the person of Tong Quinong, owner of the Malaysian opposition newspaper, The Edge. Rozak immediately ordered Low to leave the country and hide somewhere. Najib himself nearly lost power after this publication. The opposition held mass protests, but Rozak managed to suppress them and retain his seat as prime minister. However, it was Jho who received the most attention. After Claire's article, journalists from The Wall Street Journal, which quickly managed to find a source directly within the fund, reportedly did the same. For months, they studied the documents he provided, trying to understand how Low siphoned off and hid the money. Then, they published a detailed investigation that left Jho with no chance of being exonerated. His accounts in the US, Singapore, and Switzerland were frozen. One after another, celebrities disowned him. Law himself faced criminal charges in several countries. However, he has yet to be held accountable.